Good evening and welcome to our Community Budget Committee meeting for the 22-23 budget season. We are so very happy to have our committee back together again, and we appreciate their service. And at this time, I will turn it over to Ms. Kimberly Loring, our Deputy Superintendent for Business and Finance. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to our Community Budget Committee meeting for the 20.
Thank you, Superintendent Adams. This evening, I'm just going to start with introductions of the committee. We have our same 5 committee members that we did last year, and we're so grateful that they were able to return and rededicate that time as we go through the 22-23 budget development process. If we could advance. Our committee members one more time this year include Ms. Dana Brown, Mr. Scott Dolan, Ms. Dahlia Herring, Mr. Mansour Khan, and Ms. Rebecca Zimmerman. Our expectations for the committee this year is that it will meet 4 times, including this evening. Materials will be sent to all the committee members in advance for review, and supplemental financial information is also available on the district's website under the Departments of Business and Finance. We wanted to start out just by speaking to the fact that state aid was shared out. Governor Hochul did present her budget last week for 22-23. It does include funding for an increase in foundation aid in keeping with her commitment last fall to move towards fully funding foundation aid. We are doing a detailed review of the state aid runs now to see what it means for the City School District of Albany, and an update on state aid will be provided as part of our February 7th Budget Committee meeting. As we look at our budget process over the next couple of months, I wanted to just share out a few key dates. The board will receive updates on February 10th, March 3rd, and March 17th as we move through the budget development process. On March 24th, we're going to give you a virtual community budget presentation. And as part of that presentation, the board will be able to hear directly from the community some feedback on where we stand in the budget development process. We anticipate presenting the proposed budget on April 7th. There will be another meeting of the board on April 11th, and anticipate at this time budget adoption on April 14th. The annual public hearing will be May 5th. And our vote date is May 17th this year. We wanted to start this evening by sharing out some key terms. Our rollover budget contains all current staffing and programs from the general fund carried forward for the next fiscal year, along with our known contractual obligations. A modified rollover budget this year includes our rollover budget plus items that have been identified to be transferred from our one-time federal grants into the general fund for fiscal year 22-23. Our rollover budget includes a continuation of the existing programs and services as well as those contractual obligations, continuation of district operations, staffing, and benefits provided under our labor contracts. The modified rollover budget includes the above, plus absorption of identified programs and staffing funded with one-time federal funds for the fiscal year 21-22. The modified rollover budget does not include new funding or staffing requests that have been submitted for 22-23, does not address any mandates that require more resources, nor does it include other items that may be considered essential for programming, health, or safety. The 22-23 modified rollover budget adjustments do include renewing our HVAC preventive maintenance contract, funding a pool maintenance contract for the district's 5 pools, returning summer school to the general fund. It's been able to be funded with grants the past couple of summers. Returning our extended day night school program over at Brooklyn to the 2019-20 level of funding. Additional behavior specialist positions, as well as mandated nursing positions that were added in the 21-22 budget. Additional modified rollover budget adjustments to maintain current programs and operations also include an increase in software licenses to build in those that have been previously funded by grants. Also an increase for technology hardware to support the Chromebook replacement schedule now that we are a one-to-one district. And an increase for funding hall monitor and maintenance overtime to support our after-school programming and facilities use that's more typical for the district. Additionally, funding for programs and staff expensed in Sarissa and ARP that have been identified to be included at this time are the Albany International Center and Dual Language Program Expansion, Tony Clement Center for Education, faculty support and administrative positions, some of which are identified below. As we put it all together, the cost drivers of our modified rollover budget include benefits increase of $3.5 million, which includes the district's contributions to the retirement systems, as well as health insurance expenditures. Our debt service on capital projects is actually anticipated to decrease for fiscal year 23 by $296,000. Our salary expense is anticipated to go up $6.9 million, but it is really important to note that that is not just contractual salary increases. It also includes rolling into the general fund a number of positions that were funded with those one-time federal dollars. Returning summer school to the general fund for $595,000, an increase in our overtime and sub-funding for hall monitors and maintenance. Again, that's looking at a more typical after-school programming activities and facilities use of the community. Technology, hardware, and software of about $741,000. Maintenance contract services and supply expenditures of $1.5 million. That's not just associated with a full maintenance contract and our renewing our HVAC, but also other increases we've seen in terms of service and repairs and the supply costs as we maintain our cleaning and disinfecting levels and providing supplies in each of the classrooms. Charter school tuition at $2.38 million. This includes an annual tuition rate increase, as well as enrollment of additional students. The Nurses Middle College program is scheduled to open in the fall, and we do anticipate a number of Albany students selecting that program. We also have the continued middle grade rollout of Albany Leadership Academy. Other miscellaneous adjustments to the budget of $2.37 million for a total of $18.45 million. In comparing our modified rollover budget to our 21-22 adopted budget, which was $270.26 million, the modified rollover budget at this time sits at $288.72 million. That's a difference of $18.45 million, or 6.8%. Again, the figures above do not include any new funding or staffing requests submitted for 22-23, or additional items needed to address mandates, or considered essential for programming health and safety. As we continue through the budget development process, some of the variables we will be working through include state aid. Governor Hochul did release her proposed budget last week, but final state aid is typically not known until late March. Health insurance increases are finalized in March. We'll be working on the tax cap calculation to share out with you at an upcoming committee meeting. That's due by March 1st. And the tax levy that is set when the board adopts the budget to present to the voters in April. We also are going to be looking at the impact of any retirements that we have been made aware of and the continuing impact of COVID-19 on our district operations and associated expenditures. I want to stop there and kind of talk through any questions that you may have at this time before we move on to the next meeting dates.
I'd like to say this is very early in the process. Just this is exactly what we have shared out with our board. Staff will be working on some of these items to look at what needs to be additional items that may need to be absorbed into the general fund. If we receive information with regard to additional grants that we may have to pull some of the items out of the general fund, then we may be able to do that as well. So this is right up front, this is just very preliminary, but as we move through this process, if you remember from last year, you know, the numbers start to make a little bit more sense as we start to move through. I do know that we will be sharing out the state aid run, so that everyone, even though it's public, we will be sharing it out in our information so that everyone is aware of the breakdown of the funds. We typically do that at our next board meeting so that everyone is aware of that. And so we'll have all of that for backup information. But again, we did just receive that, I won't say just, but we did receive that information last week. And so now we're going through that information to see where we are in terms of what are some of those things that have to be absorbed into the general fund. What are some of those things with ARP money that we have projected we could, save a little bit in our spending and absorb some of that in our APR money. No, I'm sorry. Our ARP money, our ARP money. And so as we look at that, we will be making adjustments as we move forward.
I think if I could just add to that briefly, we do our first full revenue review with the committee and the board in a couple of weeks, which will give us a sense of kind of where we sit on that side of the budget. That starts to really inform what our expense work needs to look like in terms of what we can roll into, what we may continue in ARP, what we might be able to add as we start to refine that revenue and move through the budget development process. So the next kind of steps is to start looking at what those priority items would be and making sure that we're really clear on that. And also hearing from you once again in terms of what are the priorities in the community as you were able to provide last year, which was so meaningful input for our budget development process.
And I don't know if now is the time, but maybe as we move forward, just some conversations or more information around how the district makes decisions about grant funded initiatives and how those roll over into the general fund and the sort of criteria that might be driving that. I think that will help maybe inform where our heads are around some of the priorities.
I can speak to that a little bit right now, high level. When we looked at some of the information that we had provided to our community last year as part of our budget development process, we had identified at that time an interest in bringing forward some of those programs that we were able to reinstate, like the Albany International Center and the expansion of dual language, into the general fund as highest priorities for 22-23, because they are programs that we intend as a district to sustain long term. And providing that stable funding source by being woven into the general fund was something that was very important. So that's part of the reason why we see those woven in now. We'll continue to evaluate some of the other positions and things that were funded in the one-time dollars. And one of the other action items we're going through is taking a look at what we funded in Sarasota and ARP that we shared out with the community and reviewing what of those are one-time items that we've completed, what are items that we would sustain in those one-time dollars, and then, transparently identifying what we're bringing into the general fund as those longer-term programmatic expenses and staffing. Does that help answer the question, at least for a starting point?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
I think to add to that, when we look instructionally, we know that we hired a number of reading teachers and a number of math interventionists. And so we know that literacy and mathematics are two core areas. And so we would be looking at how many of those positions we could move out of the one-time dollars into our general fund, because we know that the support for our students, it's not going to end after 1 year. It's not going to end after 3 years. That's something that we would look at, even if it has to happen in a phased in process. So arbitrary number, let's just say that if we, and I'm just going to use arbitrary numbers right now. If there were, 10 reading teachers and maybe we can't afford to absorb all 10 this year, we might be able to absorb 5 in the general fund this year, and then we would carry 5 in the one-time money, knowing that the following year we would want to make sure that those 5 teachers were absorbed in the general fund, because we know that that's something that we need to continue and maintain for our literacy. And then if the same thing were true for mathematics, it would be the same for our math instructors or math interventionists. So that's how those decisions are made. It's based on the needs of our students. It's based on their data. And so we would analyze that, and then we would make that determination that absolutely, these are positions that we need to absorb in the general fund. But then now, how do we prioritize that absorption in the general fund? Do we absorb all of them, or do we take half now and half later?
And in that review, the other thing that we'll continue to be mindful of is what are permissible expenses with the ARP dollars that we have. Because there's very clear guidance around the things that we can fund with those dollars. So we want to make sure that we remain in compliance.
That leads me to something I had a question about, which is how the district decides salaries and what kind of leeway the district has. I'm particularly thinking about things like hall monitors. I see there's a line for increasing funding for hall monitors and maintenance overtime to support programming and facilities use, but I know that there's kind of a crisis in terms of hiring and retaining those types of staff. And is there any discussion on how we could do that better, particularly in terms of perhaps increasing salaries? Is that considered anywhere in the budget?
So that would be, I'll start, and then of course, Ms. Roaring can chime in. That's through our negotiated agreements. And so we would work with our bargaining units with regard to that. We are not in negotiations right now with our support staff unit. And so we would have to look at, various MOAs, et cetera, that may have to be put in place. But that is done through the negotiated agreement process. So Ms. Roaring?
I think the only thing I would add to that is that we did just negotiate that contract last year with the support union. So we did our negotiations with them during the pandemic, which is a very different place to start from. But there are certainly opportunities, if that is determined to be a best path forward, to have those conversations, as Mrs. Adams alluded to look at, if there's some sort of one-time adjustment that might be appropriately made to incent.
Other questions?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, I don't know if I have a question, but when you start to talk about things like reading teachers and math interventionists, I can only imagine that the demand and the need for that is growing right now, right? Just given the amount of time that students are spending on task in those specific areas. The fact that, because of the reality that we're living through right now, we have in and out. It's just, there's a longer term perspective that we need to have around how we continue to create an equitable situation for our students. So, I think these are areas that, from my perspective, I think we need to really make a strong case for because there's just going to be more need because of what we've gone through with the pandemic. So, I think that's something we can continue to talk about here as we move forward.
Thank you for that input.
Agreed. Did someone else have a comment? Ms. Zimmerman, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so sort of in line with what Scott was saying, in terms of, I don't, it's hard to wrap one's head around everything that's happened these past few years and how to sort of collectivize all the data. But if you just look like kind of individually at our kids' experiences, it seems like there are a lot of behaviors, which is understandable. Now, I don't know if that is more than it had been, just as a result of all the trauma people have been through. But in terms of bigger picture and like talking about moving forward, I know based on a previous presentation to the board, there was talk about like identifying students, for instance, for special education services, that sort of understandably fell a little by the wayside during virtual learning. So, you know, are we looking at catching up on those evaluations? And like, does that mean extra funding? Does that mean we need extra people? I know we're hiring more behavior specialists, but yeah, it's just, you know, sort of like with the reading specialists, it's almost hard to figure out how to put it all together. And even from my perspective, you know, I know that we used to have the Tony Clements Center for Education available for middle school students, which my understanding is it's for high school students now. And I believe that they're doing everything they can in the middle schools to sort of address the needs of the population, the behavioral needs. And I just feel like I don't know if all the supports are there that we need and how to work through this budget to kind of make sure there's not too much pressure in any one building for staff to handle. So it's kind of just a comment, not really a question, I guess, just a comment on, you know, I feel those concerns almost more than when we were going over this last year. And that's just sort of what's on my mind as I'm looking at all these numbers.
So a number of the, like when you talk about special ed services, we've had teleservices, and that was one of the reasons why we tried to keep, based on parent choice though, but we tried to keep as many of our special education students in school, even throughout the pandemic, because we knew meeting those IEPs and the requirements would be a challenge. And so you're absolutely right. The services that have been provided, you know, we've been able to do that, but what is that next level? And so each department, so I'll go back over a little bit of the process. Each department and school will submit their budget asks based on their needs and based on their own data. So behind the scenes, there's a lot that's happening to give us that information in terms of when we say, oh, we will need, you know, 8 behavioral specialists or 5. And again, I'm using arbitrary numbers. Where do we get that information from? It's based on the data that is submitted to us by each department. And then the schools have their input. So there's a lot of work that goes in, you know, I don't want to, well, behind the scenes with information that is gathered so that then we know what are the asks from each department and each school so that we can then look and see how that fits into the budget. And then what we ask the departments to do, as well as the schools, is prioritize their asks, because most of the time, you know, there is a finite pot of money. Even now, there's a finite pot of money. And so we have to look at how we prioritize that. And so within special education services, we will look at, you know, the ratios that we have, who are the support folks that are in place, the teachers that are in place, as well as the administrators that are in place. And then based on the needs, then we will make some determinations about which positions need to be added in order to support special education services. At our last board meeting, we did talk about Tony Clements Center for Education, and as we speak, we're advertising those positions so that we can look to build in the middle school component. So that's already being addressed, but it does depend on the staffing of it. And we are looking at a 3rd quarter rollout. So out of this year's budget, we're looking at a 3rd quarter rollout of Tony Clement Center for Education at the middle school level. And so what that would mean is, how does that translate to the budget moving forward for the fall of 22-23?
All right, thank you. That's good to know. And I saw that, if I understand, there's also expected to be an increase in English language learners. And so I imagine it's difficult to try to project and fit that all together with these new buildings and new programs.
So I have a question, but I'm not sure. This is sort of off topic, and I'm not sure if we're going to get to it or.
If I could just for a minute, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Please.
The AIC, the ELL component, we did have a presentation at the last board meeting with regard to AIC and talking about what the next steps are for AIC. And so absolutely they are included in the budget, and there will be requests that will come from there. That was also one of the priorities that Ms. Roaring addressed with regard to knowing that during the 21-22 school year, we did use our Sarissa and ARP dollars, and those were the priorities right off the bat that we knew we would need to roll into the general fund. So those are things that we are definitely looking at. So we know that there's an increase in ELL, and that is not just district-wide, but also specifically looking at our AIC program. I'm sorry, Ms. Brown, go ahead.
Thank you, Superintendent. So my question, and maybe Ms. Roaring is going to get to this, or hopefully I didn't miss something, but I'm wondering if there are things that have been discontinued, expenses that have been discontinued that might help, the budget a bit, because I know that, over the last few years, we've been doing things quite different, in 2020 and 2021 alone have looked a lot different in the needs of the district, and then going completely in person this year. So I'm wondering, what have been some of the cost savings from things that no longer need to be continued, or subscriptions that don't need to be continued, or whatever it may be, and how are they impacting the budget?
So at this time, I think we're actually not seeing a lot of discontinuance. We're actually identifying software licenses that are going to be absorbed into the general fund, that we've used grants and one-time sources to fund, that have really been woven into the fabric of our day-to-day instruction, and determined to be essential as we move forward to continue that instruction and student growth and development. In terms of, there may be some anticipated adjustments on the maintenance side, but we recognize that this is really now a new base point. It's not something that we would intend to move backwards from in terms of looking at how we clean and disinfect our buildings, and the supplies that we are using to do that, and the volume of supplies that is required is actually increased as opposed to decreased. So to sustain that level, we are anticipating an increase next year, which is codified in the cost drivers. So we haven't necessarily identified things that would be going away. We do know we had some one-time expenses in the ARP and Sarissa, and those we will clearly delineate and share out so that it's clear what was expensed for those purposes and is not going to be folded into the general fund or continued in one-time money, because it was just that one-time need.
Any other questions or any information that you will need? I know that we have, so I'm going to kind of work backwards from what some of the requests have been. First of all, the discontinued expenses, those cost savings. So we may have to look at that in terms of adjustments of one-time funds, which really means that it was used for this year, but that doesn't mean it goes away. It means that maybe we have additional one-time expenses that we can reallocate those dollars to. We will have to look at that and see, but looking at, I'll still say the discontinued expenses and what that looks like. Requesting information with regard to social, emotional, mental health, and special education services. Looking at our ELL and AIC requests, where that fits in. Also the Tony Clement Center of Education, the expansion to the middle school program. We've talked about that, but then to put those dollars next to it so that we can see exactly what that is. And then looking at the positions that we are looking at rolling into the general fund that were funded through Sarissa and ARP, and what that looks like. And then I guess the big caveat is what is permissible for us to use the ARP funds and what is not, to make sure that we're staying in alignment with that. those are the items that I have as takeaways with regard to more information for the committee. Did I miss anything? Any other items that the committee may want to see? Again, this is very early, but any other items that you think you may want to see as we move forward? And we know we'll have additional requests as we move through the process, but anything that you can think of now?
I have a question about maintenance contracts in general, or like facilities type things, just in terms of how they work. Like, do we sign a contract and then we can call, you know, is it like pay per time they come out, or like how does it work if they're working on a problem that kind of needs to be repeatedly worked on? Like, is how the district is charged worked into those contracts? And for things like the pool maintenance contract, does that include training and part, you know, I guess I'm just a little foggy on those, like, I don't know if those contracts are, you know, publicly available or how those look.
So I'm happy to start, and then Superintendent Adams, if I missed anything, if you want to add. When we do a contract process, and I'll be specific to maintenance because I oversee that, we go out in an RFP process or RFB process. We actually put out a proposal and ask companies in the area through direct solicitation and advertising to bid that work. And then we evaluate the responses from a monetary perspective as well as past performance to make sure that we know we're going to have a good partner in that work. That contract then goes before the board for approval, and it is an annual contract. So each spring you will see a series of contracts come forward to the Board of Education, particular to the maintenance department, whether we're making a recommendation to renew a contract or whether or not we've done a new RFP and we need to award that RFP for services. So we'll have, for example, we have contracts with a roofer to come out and do roof repairs. We have contracts with electricians and plumbers and HVAC. We also have contracts with a glass company so that they can come out and repair broken windows for us and things like replace broken windows, I should say, for us, as well as looking at, you know, the preventive maintenance contract for our HVAC and looking at pool maintenance contracts. We have not looked at whether or not a contract on pool maintenance would specifically include training. We've been utilizing another partner in the community that does certified pool operator training for our staff to make sure that they are trained on how to manage and navigate the chemical management of the pool, as well as temperature readings and other things that are required to be done on a daily basis. And then looking at the pool maintenance contract is something that would be kind of overarching from all of the various mechanical components that are in our pools, which, as I have learned, is much more extensive than is in your personal pool if you were to have one at your house. So making sure that we have somebody who's monitoring, managing, and servicing those components that are essential to the ongoing operation of the pools is something that we really needed to do. So that's kind of somewhat of a response, I hope, to the question. And if I didn't provide greater clarity, if you would please let me know how I might be able to better assist with that. I'm happy to talk further on that.
Yeah, so I'm curious, for instance, let's say there is a problem and it has to be like they have to come out repeatedly for it. For instance, they fix the roof, it leaks, they fix it. It leaks, they fix it. What happens in those type of situations? Like, is there, like, do we track it, and you know that those types of things then are under consideration when during this annual contract negotiation? Like, are we paying for just them to fix the roof leak, or if it keeps leaking, we pay them for all 3 times they came to fix the leak? Like, just those minor things.
So I think it's just not. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, I'm just like curious about the actual details in terms of how they are doing that work.
So for service and repair contracts, typically it's based on an hourly rate. So they are paid for the hours of service, and that's outlined in the contract that the board approves. We also reimburse them at an equal cost for any supplies or materials that they have to procure on our behalf to complete those repairs. If they were to come out and do the exact same roof repair multiple times in a year, then that is a conversation that we're having with them as to why the repair is not holding. Why didn't it work the first time? Because we don't think that we should have to pay for the exact same repair multiple times. And that actually absolutely comes into our evaluation over the next couple months as to whether or not we would consider recommending contractors for renewal, or whether we would be going out to do a new RFP process and putting them on notice that we will not be renewing their contract for next year. All of those experiences come into play at this point in time where we start to look at those things and plan for next year.
Thank you.
On a different note, it might be helpful to have a bit more of a more detailed breakdown for both the salary expense in terms of how much of that is based on negotiated contract increases versus the new positions that were identified, or the rollover positions that were identified. And then for the same for the line item for the miscellaneous, if there's maybe a bit more of a detailed breakdown around what's driving that increase.
I totally agree with that.
Okay, we can look at that because we have salary tables that we work through the negotiated agreement. So it would be basically looking at those salary tables. So we can definitely, I mean, and our contracts are public documents too. So we can definitely provide that with regard to, we can do it by a bargaining unit because those salary tables are, I mean, it's part of the negotiated agreement.
And I have a few questions about like just kind of where things are in the budget, or if they're there in terms of like the safety or maybe like increased safety needs of some of our schools.
That happens through the budget process, and that's through safety and security through Vince Thompson, who is our director. Those things happen within those departments.
Okay, so that's as we move forward, that's something we'll learn about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then one more area that, again, I know that I guess there's, negotiations and salaries and things, but I've noticed like for hard to fill areas, like in addition to the hall monitors, but certain subjects of teachers, if there's any like discussion on if there are historically like areas that are hard to fill, if there's room somewhere in the budget to discuss those types of things, and if there's anything that can be done to kind of help fix that.
Say that again.
Sorry, yeah, it's just like my understanding is if there, which you had alluded to this before with the hall monitors, but for like when I looked at some of the past board presentations about, I think they called them hard to fill positions, and I think they had like math, science, business, and world languages. That I guess, why are they hard to fill? Like if we're discussing the budget, is there any room for like a one-time thing, or is there any way that could be something considered in the budget? I don't know how much of a problem it is, or if it's,
That's all through negotiations. That's all through anything with the salaries, that's going to be through negotiations.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to go back to that point or a question I was asking. I don't want to make you all do work that I think it's more about what percentage of that is just based on the salary increases versus what the percentage is that's based on positions that were that are now rolling over, right?
Right, because there's some that are vacant. There's some cost savings in the fact that there may have been vacancies that we did not fill. And I'll kind of weave in the answer. What makes a position hard to fill? Number one, it depends on the subject area. We may not have enough people who are math majors coming out in this year of graduates so that we can fill those positions. We may not have science teachers, you know what I mean? Those are those hard to fill positions because it's simply the fact that you may not have enough of those certified people to fill those positions. When we look at other positions, it may be the labor force. We look at, we've shared this out at our board meetings with regard to some of our support positions. It's not that we don't have the line items to hire people. People are not applying for those positions, and we are still recruiting. We have enhanced our recruiting efforts. We've looked at what we can do to attract and retain more folks in different positions. So there are a number of reasons that positions can be hard to fill, from certification to the types of jobs, being competitive in a school district, but also being competitive with private industry. And private industry is very different when you look at salaries in private industry versus public institutions. When we talk about those things, those are the things that contribute to positions being hard to fill. And so most of that falls outside of this purview because it is going to fall within the negotiated, within the bargaining units and handled through negotiations.
If I could circle back to Mr. Dolan's question or comment for a minute, I think you're referring to the $6.9 million salary driver and looking at that more from what percent of that might be associated with contractual salary increases versus what percent of that might be associated with absorbing some of those one-time funded positions or other increases that we needed to make along the way. To other lines of salary expense. So I think I understood exactly how you wanted to look at that. If I have not captured that correctly, if you could let me know.
It was perfectly captured.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I guess, do you all have a sense of the other side of the budget, the revenue at this time, or is that just, I mean, I know you said the governor has released the early part of that, but.
So the state aid runs have happened. That's part one from the governor. And then what happens now is our legislators, in fact, we will be testifying in front of the Senate with regard to what our asks are. Of course, thanking them for all of their support with making sure that we are on the right path for being fully funded with our foundation aid, which we're very, very excited about. And then the other caveat is, you know, making sure that we advocate for the expense-based aids not to be reduced as we look to become fully funded with the foundation aid, not offsetting that with decreases in our expense-based aids. And we don't see that happening. And we are very, very fortunate and very, very happy to see that those things are moving forward as they said they would, because that really will help our district quite a bit. But the next steps will be for the legislators to then look at the budget and then see where they may make increases. I won't say the other part decreases. I won't say that, because we'll see where they're going to make increases in the budget to assist with, you know, some of those wraparound services that we need when we talk about social emotional learning and mental health with our students, and how we're able to meet the needs of our students and families with our wraparound services.
And I think just to expand on that in a different vein, that's one aspect of our revenue side, right? We know we also have local, federal, and other sources of revenue that we're doing some analysis on now. That tax cap calculation that we'll be working on over the next couple of weeks to file by the end of February. to start to have some conversations with the board in terms of where we might be landing with that, where we could go.